The porcelain vase hit the marble floor and shattered into 100 pieces, and every eye in the drawing room turned to Eliza Marlowe. She had not touched it. She had been standing 3 feet away, folding linens near the window, when Lady Constance Vale's sleeve caught the edge of the side table and sent the vase tumbling. But Constance did not hesitate. She spun around, pointed a trembling finger at Eliza, and declared in a voice loud enough to carry through the whole house that the clumsy maid had broken a piece that had belonged to the Ashworth family for 4 generations. Eliza opened her mouth to explain, then closed it again. She had learned long ago that a servant's word meant nothing against a lady's accusation, especially in this house. "I am so sorry, my lady," she said quietly, kneeling to gather the broken shards with bare hands. A sharp edge cut her palm, and a thin line of blood traced across her skin, but she did not flinch. She had grown used to small pains. They were easier to bear than the humiliation burning in her chest. Constance folded her arms and watched with cold satisfaction. "You will pay for this out of your wages. Every last piece was imported from Italy. I doubt your entire year's earnings could replace it." The other servants in the room lowered their eyes, none daring to speak in Eliza's defense. Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, stood near the doorway with her lips pressed into a thin line, saying nothing, though something flickered behind her eyes that looked almost like anger. It was at that exact moment that the front doors of Ashworth Hall opened, and a gust of cold autumn air swept through the entrance hall, carrying with it the sound of boots on stone. Duke Nathaniel Ashworth had not been expected for another week. He stepped into the drawing room still wearing his traveling coat, dust from the road still clinging to his boots, and stopped short at the sight before him. A maid on her knees, blood on her hand, broken porcelain scattered around her, and his cousin Constance standing over her like a judge passing sentence. "What is happening here?" His voice was not loud, but it filled the room in a way that made everyone straighten. Constance's expression shifted instantly, softening into something practiced and pleasant. "Nathaniel, you are early. This is nothing, truly, just a clumsy accident." The girl broke the Florentine vase. Nathaniel's gaze moved from his cousin to the young woman on the floor. She had not looked up yet. Her hands were steady despite the cut, carefully placing each shard onto a cloth someone had finally thought to hand her. There was something in the set of her shoulders, a quiet dignity that did not match the picture of a careless servant that Constance was painting. "Your hand is bleeding," he said, addressing Eliza directly. The room went still. Servants did not often receive direct words from the Duke himself, and certainly not words of concern. Eliza finally lifted her eyes to meet his. For a moment neither of them spoke. She saw a tall man with tired eyes from a long journey, but eyes that were sharp and assessing, taking in far more than the scene in front of him seemed to offer. He saw a young woman with straight posture, a steady gaze that did not waver even in humiliation, and hands that trembled only slightly despite the wound. "It is nothing, Your Grace," she said. "I will clean it and return to my duties." "You will see it properly bandaged first," Nathaniel said, and though his voice remained calm, there was an authority in it that left no room for argument. He turned to Mrs. Whitfield. "See that she is cared for." Mrs. Whitfield nodded quickly. "Of course, Your Grace." Constance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nathaniel, you needn't trouble yourself over a servant's scrape. I will have the wages deducted for the vase, and the matter will be settled." "The matter is not settled," Nathaniel said, turning his attention fully to his cousin now. "I have been away for 3 years, Constance, not blind for 3 years. I know the value of that vase, and I also know it did not break because a maid was careless. Porcelain does not fly across a room on its own." A flicker of alarm crossed Constance's face before she smoothed it away. "I do not know what you mean to imply." "I imply nothing yet," Nathaniel said. "I only observe that accusations made quickly are not always accusations made truthfully." He did not wait for a response. Instead, he crossed the room, knelt beside Eliza despite the disapproving murmur that rippled through the small gathering of onlookers, and examined her hand himself. His touch was careful, businesslike, but there was a gentleness in it that surprised her. "This needs to be cleaned properly, or it will fester," he said. "What is your name?" "Eliza, Your Grace. Eliza Marlowe." "Marlowe." He repeated the name slowly, as though testing it against a memory. For a brief moment, his brow furrowed, but then he simply nodded and rose to his feet. "See that Miss Marlowe is taken to have her hand looked after, Mrs. Whitfield, and see that the cost of the vase, if there is truly a cost to be settled, is discussed with me directly before any wages are touched." The housekeeper curtsied and gestured for Eliza to follow her out. As Eliza rose from the floor, She allowed herself one glance back at the Duke, uncertain what to make of him. In 3 years of service at Ashworth Hall, under the previous Duke and now this one, she had never once been treated as though her pain mattered. Nathaniel watched her go, something unsettled stirring in his chest that he could not quite name. There had been a familiarity in her face, in the shape of her eyes, that nagged at the edge of his memory, though he could not place where he might have seen her before. He had spent years traveling for the family's business abroad, and there were countless faces from countless ballrooms and gatherings that blurred together in his mind. But this felt different. This felt like something closer, something he should remember but could not quite reach. Constance watched the exchange with growing unease. She had spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself as the future Duchess of Ashworth, carefully cultivating Nathaniel's trust through his correspondence while he was away, ensuring that no other woman came near enough to threaten her plans. She had not anticipated that a servant of all people might catch his attention within moments of his return. "You seem quite concerned for a housemaid," she said carefully, once the room had mostly emptied and only she and Nathaniel remained near the fireplace. "I am concerned for fairness," Nathaniel replied. "I have been gone a long time, Constance. I intend to look closely at how this house has been run in my absence, all of it." Something cold passed behind Constance's eyes, before she masked it with a smile. "Of course. You will find everything has been managed exactly as it should be." He said nothing to that, only turned to look out the tall window toward the gardens, where the last of the autumn light was fading into gray. Somewhere in the servants' quarters, a young woman was having her hand bandaged, unaware that her quiet dignity, in a moment of unjust cruelty, had already begun to change the course of everything at Ashworth Hall. In the small room off the kitchen where the servants tended to minor injuries, Mrs. Whitfield cleaned the cut on Eliza's palm with careful hands, her expression unreadable. "That was not an accident you caused," the housekeeper said quietly, once they were alone. "I saw Lady Constance's sleeve catch the table. I saw it clearly." Eliza's throat tightened. "Then why did you say nothing?" "Because in this house, housekeepers who contradict a lady of Constance's standing do not remain housekeepers for long." Mrs. Whitfield wrapped a clean strip of linen around Eliza's palm and tied it firmly. But the Duke saw something too. "I watched his face. He is not a fool, whatever his cousin believes." "He asked my name," Eliza said, almost to herself, as though still trying to understand why that small fact felt so significant. "He did more than that," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice dropping lower. "He looked at you as though he were trying to remember something. I have worked in this house for 20 years, Eliza. I know every face that has passed through these halls, and I have never once seen the Duke look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight." Eliza shook her head slowly, unwilling to let herself hope for anything beyond the end of her shift and a quiet night's sleep. She had learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing for a servant to carry. Her father's fall from grace had taught her that lesson more thoroughly than any other, stripping her family of its name and its comfort in the span of a single terrible year, and leaving her, the daughter of once respected people, scrubbing floors in a house where no one remembered or cared who she used to be. But that night, lying on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters with her bandaged hand resting against her chest, Eliza found herself thinking not of the broken vase or Constance's cruelty, but of the way the Duke's eyes had searched her face, as though he were standing at the edge of a memory he could not quite step into. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not concern themselves with housemaids beyond a single evening's passing curiosity. She was wrong, though she would not understand how wrong for quite some time yet. Outside her small window, the last candle in the Duke's study burned late into the night. Nathaniel sat at his desk, an old family ledger open before him, though his eyes were not truly reading the figures in front of him. Instead, his mind kept returning to a name from years past, a family that had once been welcome at Ashworth Hall before scandal and ruin had erased them from polite memory. Marlowe. He closed the ledger slowly, a strange certainty settling over him that his return home was going to uncover far more than mismanaged accounts and family politics. Somewhere in the quiet corners of this house, buried under years of servitude and silence, was a truth waiting to be found. And whatever it was, he intended to find it. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the dark shape of the gardens below. Years ago, before he had been sent away to manage the family's distant holdings, this house had been filled with different voices, different laughter. He remembered a family of modest but respected standing who had once been regular guests at Ashworth Hall, a father with kind eyes and a young daughter who used to run through these very gardens during summer visits. He remembered, too, the sudden silence that had followed their disappearance from society, a silence no one had ever fully explained to him. He had been too young then to ask the right questions, and too far away in the years since to seek the answers. But standing in his study now, with the memory of a housemaid's steady gaze still fresh in his mind, he felt the past pressing close, demanding to be examined at last. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin looking through the older household records. If there was a connection between the girl kneeling on his drawing room floor tonight and the family he remembered from his childhood, he intended to find it, whatever the cost to the comfortable lies that had settled over this house in his absence. The candle in his study burned down to nothing before he finally left it, and even then, sleep did not come easily. By morning, word of the Duke's unusual attention toward a housemaid had already begun to spread through the servants' quarters, whispered between polishing silver and folding linens. Eliza tried to ignore it, keeping her head down and her hands busy, but she could feel eyes following her wherever she went. She had not expected to see the Duke again so soon. Yet just after midday, as she carried a stack of fresh linens down the east corridor, she found him standing near the entrance to the old library, a leather-bound ledger tucked beneath one arm. "Miss Marlowe," he said her name easily, as though he had been using it for years rather than one evening. "A moment, if you would." Eliza stopped, startled, and adjusted the linens in her arms. "Your Grace. How is your hand?" "Healing well, thank you." She held up her bandaged palm briefly, unsure why the question made her chest feel strangely warm. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, and there was something searching in his expression, the same searching look she had noticed the night before. "I wonder if I might ask your opinion on something." Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not among them. Servants were not asked their opinions. They were given instructions and expected to follow them without comment. "My opinion, Your Grace?" "On the household accounts," he gestured to the ledger under his arm. "I have been reviewing the estate's expenditures from the past 3 years, and there are inconsistencies I cannot explain. You have worked in this house through that entire period, have you not?" "I have, Your Grace, but I am only a maid. I would not know anything about accounts." "You would know," Nathaniel said. "Which rooms were closed for renovation and which were not. Which staff were let go and which were hired. Small details that do not appear in ledgers but that might explain why certain sums do not add up." Eliza hesitated, torn between the instinct to remain invisible, which had kept her safe for 3 years, and a curiosity she could not quite suppress. There was something in the Duke's tone that suggested he genuinely wanted to know, not simply that he was testing her. There was a period, perhaps a year and a half ago, when Lady Constance ordered several rooms in the West Wing refurbished, she said carefully. New furnishings were brought in, though I never saw workmen doing any actual renovation. The old furniture was said to be sold, but I never saw it leave the estate either. Nathaniel's expression sharpened with interest. "Go on." "I should not say more, Your Grace. It is not my place. I am making it your place, for this conversation," he said. "I give you my word that nothing you tell me will be repeated in a way that brings harm to you." Something in his steady gaze convinced her he meant it. Slowly, carefully, she told him what she had observed over the months, small details gathered simply from being present in a house where servants were treated as invisible, and therefore heard and saw far more than anyone realized. Furniture that vanished without record of a sale. Deliveries that arrived at odd hours and were carried in through the servant's entrance rather than the front. A steady stream of expenses attributed to household repairs that never seemed to result in any visible repair at all. By the time she finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Thank you, Miss Marlowe. You have been more helpful than you know. Please, Your Grace, if Lady Constance learns that I have spoken of this, she will not learn it from me." He said it firmly, and something in his voice made her believe him completely. Over the following days, small moments like this one began to repeat themselves. Nathaniel found reasons to seek her out, always with a plausible task attached. A question about the household, a request to confirm some small detail of the estate's daily workings. Eliza told herself each time that it was simply the Duke being thorough in his investigation of the household accounts, nothing more. But she noticed, too, that his questions began to wander beyond ledgers and expenditures. He asked about her family once, carefully, and though she gave him only the barest details, something in his face told her he was turning the information over in his mind, searching for a connection he had not yet named aloud. Constance noticed the pattern before anyone else did. She had built her position in this house through careful observation, through knowing exactly what everyone around her was doing at all times, and it did not take her long to realize that the Duke's path through Ashworth Hall had begun crossing far too often with that of a common housemaid. She raised the matter with her cousin Edmund one evening in the small parlor reserved for family use, her voice low despite the empty room around them. "He spends time with her," Constance said. "I have seen it myself. Questions about the household, he claims, but I do not believe questions about linens require so much conversation." Edmund, seated near the fireplace with a glass of brandy in hand, raised an eyebrow. "Nathaniel has always been overly conscientious. It is likely nothing more than his usual thoroughness." "It is not nothing," Constance snapped. "I have spent 2 years securing his trust while he traveled, writing to him faithfully, managing this household exactly as a future duchess should. I will not have some servant girl undo that because Nathaniel has developed a sudden interest in fairness." Edmund studied his cousin for a long moment, considering. He had his own reasons for wanting to see Constance secured as the future Duchess of Ashworth Hall, reasons that had little to do with affection for her and everything to do with the arrangements they had quietly made regarding the estate's finances once she held real influence over the household. If Constance's position was threatened, so too was his own comfortable arrangement. "What do you propose we do about it?" he asked. "Watch her," Constance said. "Watch them both. If there is nothing between them, then I have nothing to fear. But if there is something, I want to know before it becomes a problem I cannot manage." Edmund nodded slowly. "And if it becomes a problem?" Constance's smile was thin and cold. "Then problems, Edmund, have solutions. We have found solutions to problems before." The unspoken reference hung in the air between them, a memory neither needed to speak aloud, and Edmund's expression tightened with something that might have been discomfort, though he said nothing further to challenge her. Unaware of the conversation taking place in the parlor, Eliza spent that same evening in the small room she shared with another maid, turning over the strangeness of her days in her mind. She had worked at Ashworth Hall for 3 years, and in all that time, she had been spoken to directly by a member of the family perhaps a handful of times, and never with any genuine interest in her thoughts. Now the Duke himself sought her out nearly every day, asking questions, listening carefully to her answers, treating her observations as though they carried real weight. She told herself it was simply his investigation into the household's finances. She told herself that once he found what he was looking for, his attention would move elsewhere, back to the world of ballrooms and titled ladies where it belonged, and she would return to her ordinary and visible existence among the linens and the silver. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when she caught him watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with ledgers or missing furniture, and in those moments, something in her chest stirred that she did not have a name for, and was almost afraid to examine too closely. 3 days later, Nathaniel found himself in the estate's old records room, a dusty chamber at the back of the house where decades of correspondence and family papers had been stored and largely forgotten. He had come searching for older financial records that might shed light on the discrepancies Eliza had helped him identify, but as he sorted through boxes of aging documents, his attention caught instead on a bundle of letters tied together with faded ribbon, tucked into the back of a drawer that had clearly not been opened in years. The name on the topmost letter stopped him cold. Marlowe. He untied the ribbon with careful fingers and began to read, and as he did, the pieces of a memory he had been chasing since the night of his return finally began falling into place. The letters were correspondence between his late father and a man named Charles Marlowe, once a respected gentleman farmer whose lands had bordered the Ashworth estate, a man who had been, according to these old letters, one of his father's closest friends. There was mention of a daughter. A young girl, clever and quick, who used to visit Ashworth Hall each summer with her father, running through the gardens with a freedom that only childhood could allow. Nathaniel sat back slowly, the letters trembling slightly in his hands, as understanding settled over him with the weight of ice water. The housemaid he had been drawn to since the moment of his return, the young woman with the steady gaze and the quiet dignity, was not simply some anonymous servant who happened to work in his household. She was the daughter of a man his own father had once called a dear friend, a family that had vanished from society under circumstances Nathaniel had never fully understood, and whose disappearance he was now determined, more than ever, to investigate to its very roots. He carried the bundle of letters to his study that same night, reading each one carefully by candlelight. The correspondence painted a picture of a friendship built over many years, 2 men who had hunted together, dined together, and trusted one another with matters far beyond polite conversation. In one letter, dated some 8 years past, his father had written warmly of young Eliza Marlowe's quick mind, noting with obvious fondness that she had bested his own sons at a simple game of numbers during a summer visit, and predicting she would grow into a woman of remarkable intelligence. Nathaniel read that particular line 3 times, something tightening in his chest each time. The girl his father had once praised so warmly was now scrubbing floors and mending linens in the very house where she had once been welcomed as an honored guest. He needed to understand what had happened. The letters offered hints but no clear answers, references to some unnamed trouble that had befallen the Marlowe family, a debt perhaps, or a scandal, the details deliberately vague in the way that gentlemen of that era often wrote when discussing matters they considered too delicate for plain language. Whatever had happened, it had been sudden enough and severe enough to erase an entire family from the society they had once belonged to, and thorough enough that even Nathaniel, who had known the Marlowe name only vaguely as a childhood memory, had never learned the full truth of it. The following afternoon, he sought out Mrs. Whitfield, finding her in the small office off the kitchen where she kept the household's daily accounts. "How long has Miss Marlowe been in service here?" he asked, keeping his tone carefully casual. Mrs. Whitfield looked up from her ledger, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she composed herself. 3 years, Your Grace. She came to us not long after your father passed, during the difficult months when the household was first adjusting to new management. Do you know anything of her family, her circumstances before she came here? The housekeeper hesitated, choosing her words with obvious care. I know only that she came to us in reduced circumstances, Your Grace. She never spoke much of her past, and I did not press her for details. It is not uncommon among the staff. Many of the girls who work here have stories they would rather not revisit. But you know something, Nathaniel pressed gently. I can see it in your face, Mrs. Whitfield. The housekeeper set down her pen and folded her hands. I know that when she first arrived, she carried herself like someone unaccustomed to service, someone who had once given orders rather than received them. It faded over time, as it must, but in those first months, I often thought there was a story behind her that none of us were meant to know. Nathaniel absorbed this in silence, the pieces continuing to settle into place. Whatever had happened to the Marlowe family, it had been recent enough and painful enough that even now, 3 years later, Eliza guarded the memory of it closely, revealing nothing even to the woman who had overseen her daily work for the better part of that time. He thanked Mrs. Whitfield and left the small office with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty that the truth, whatever it was, deserved to be uncovered, both for his own understanding and for the sake of a young woman who had clearly endured more than any of them realized. That evening, he found himself walking the same corridor where he had first stopped Eliza with her armful of linens, and though he told himself he had no particular reason to be there, some part of him hoped to encounter her again. When he did not, he stood for a long while at the window overlooking the gardens, thinking of a summer afternoon 8 years past that he could not quite remember, but that his father's letters had described with such warmth, a young girl's laughter carrying across the very lawns now visible in the moonlight below. He thought, too, of Constance, and of the strange tightness that had entered her voice whenever Eliza's name came up in conversation. He was not naive enough to believe his cousin's concern for propriety was the whole of her motive. There was something else beneath it, something guarded and calculating, that he had noticed more than once since his return, though he could not yet say what it meant. Whatever game was being played within the walls of Ashworth Hall, he intended to understand every piece of it before he allowed himself to make any decisions about the future. Whether that future involved his cousin's ambitions, the household's finances, or the quiet, dignified young woman whose family history was tangled somehow with his own. For now, he had only questions, but he had never been a man to leave questions unanswered for long. The summons came on a gray morning, delivered by a footman who found Eliza in the linen room, and told her simply that the Duke wished to see her in his study before the noon hour. She smoothed her apron with nervous hands and walked the length of the house wondering what she had done wrong, her mind cycling through every small task of the past week, searching for some error that might have drawn his attention. When she entered the study, Nathaniel was standing near the window, the bundle of old letters resting on his desk. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression, careful and searching, made her stomach tighten with unease. You wish to see me, Your Grace. Please, sit. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, an invitation so far outside the ordinary treatment of servants that Eliza hesitated before obeying, smoothing her skirts as she perched carefully on the edge of the seat. Nathaniel returned to his own chair, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, without fear of consequence. Do you know the name Charles Marlowe? The question landed like a physical blow. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face, her hands tightening in her lap. That was my father's name, Your Grace. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, confirmation settling over features that had clearly been braced for this answer without quite believing it until spoken aloud. I found letters, in the old records room, correspondence between your father and mine, going back many years. My father wrote of you, of a summer visit when you were perhaps 10 years old, beating his sons soundly at a game of arithmetic. Eliza's throat tightened with an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. I remember those summers, she admitted quietly. I remember your father's kindness. I did not know, when I came here seeking work, that this was the same house. Why did you not tell anyone? What would there have been to tell? Her voice held no bitterness, only a tired honesty. That I was once a guest in this house and now scrub its floors? It would have changed nothing except perhaps made my position more uncomfortable. Better to be simply another maid than a curiosity for the household to gossip over. Nathaniel absorbed this, understanding the practical wisdom in it even as something in him ached at the thought of what she had endured in silence. What happened to your family, Eliza? I have found only hints in the letters, nothing certain. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze dropping to her folded hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though clearly the words cost her something to say. My father invested unwisely, trusting a business partner who proved dishonest. Within the span of a year, we lost nearly everything. The land, the house, the standing we had held in the county for generations. My father's health failed soon after, the shame and the strain proving too much for him. He passed within 18 months of the collapse. My mother had died years earlier, when I was still young, so when my father was gone, there was no one left to provide for me. I had no living relatives willing to take in a penniless orphan with a ruined family name. Service was the only path left open to me. The simplicity of her account made it more affecting, not less. Nathaniel found himself gripping the edge of his desk, a slow anger building in his chest, at the unfairness of a world that could strip a respected family of everything within so short a span, leaving a clever, dignified young woman with no recourse but to scrub floors in the house where she had once played as a welcomed guest. I am sorry, he said quietly. My father should have done something. When your family fell, he should have offered assistance. Your father was already unwell by then, Your Grace, if I recall correctly. I do not fault him. I do not fault anyone, truly, except perhaps the man who cheated my father in the first place. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I have made my peace with my circumstances. I would ask only that you not pity me. Pity is a luxury I gave up learning to live without a long time ago. Something in her steady defiance struck him deeply, and he found himself studying her with a new kind of attention. Not the careful, searching curiosity of the past weeks, but something warmer, more personal. I do not pity you, he said honestly. I admire you. I do not think I have met many people, of any station, who could endure what you have endured and still carry themselves with the dignity you carry. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment, and she looked away, uncertain how to respond to kindness so plainly and sincerely offered. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the study door, and before Nathaniel could respond, Constance let herself in, her eyes narrowing instantly at the sight of Eliza seated across from the Duke's desk. Nathaniel, I did not realize you were occupied. Her voice was pleasant, but the coldness beneath it was unmistakable. I only wish to discuss the arrangements for the harvest gathering next week. We can discuss it later, Nathaniel said, his tone even but firm. Constance's gaze flicked between him and Eliza, calculating. Of course, though I confess I am curious what business the Duke has with a housemaid that requires her seated so comfortably in his study. The business is mine to discuss, Constance, and I do not owe you an explanation for how I choose to run my household. There was an edge to his voice now, one that made Constance's polite smile falter for just a moment before she recovered it. Naturally, she said. I only meant to say that it is somewhat unusual, and unusual things tend to draw talk among the staff. I would hate for Miss Marlowe's reputation to suffer for what is, I am sure, entirely innocent. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Eliza felt her stomach twist with dread. She rose quickly from her chair. I should return to my duties, Your Grace. Thank you for your time. Nathaniel wanted to stop her, wanted to tell Constance plainly that her insinuations were unwelcome, but he recognized the wisdom in Eliza's retreat. A prolonged confrontation would only give Constance more to work with. He nodded, allowing Eliza to slip past his cousin and out of the study, though his eyes followed her until the door closed behind her. Once they were alone, he turned his full attention to Constance. I would ask you to reconsider how you speak to the staff, Constance. Miss Marlowe has done nothing to warrant your suspicion. I only look out for the interests of this house, Constance replied smoothly. The interests I have protected faithfully these past 3 years, while you were abroad. "And I am grateful for your management," Nathaniel said, though something in his tone made it clear the gratitude was becoming more strained by the day. "But I have returned now, and I intend to look into every corner of this household's affairs myself. If there is nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear from my attention." Constance's composure held, but only just, a tightness settling around her eyes that betrayed the calculations racing behind them. "Of course, Nathaniel. I have nothing to hide." She left the study with measured steps, but the moment she was out of sight of the servants in the corridor, her expression twisted into something far less pleasant. She found Edmund in the billiard room within the hour, relaying what she had witnessed with barely controlled fury. He had her seated in his study, Edmund, seated, as though she were a guest of standing rather than a maid who empties chamber pots. This has gone far beyond simple curiosity. Edmund set down his cue stick, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "What do you propose?" "I propose we remind Nathaniel of his obligations. He has a duty to this family, to the title, to the alliance our families have long anticipated between us. A passing infatuation with a servant cannot be allowed to jeopardize that. And if reminders are not enough," Constance's eyes hardened, "then we find a way to remove the distraction entirely." The following days brought a shift in the household that Eliza felt keenly, though she could not always name its exact source. Small tasks that had once been routine became sources of humiliation, assigned specifically, it seemed, whenever Nathaniel was likely to witness them. She was ordered to scrub the front steps on her knees during the hour when guests typically arrived, made to carry heavy loads of firewood through the main hall rather than the servants' passage, given instructions that seemed designed less for practical purpose than for public embarrassment. She endured each indignity in silence, understanding without needing to be told that Constance was testing the limits of what she could inflict without drawing direct challenge from the Duke. But on the fourth day, the test went further than Eliza expected. She was in the main hall, having just finished polishing the brass fixtures along the staircase, when Constance appeared with two other members of the household staff in tow, ordering Eliza, in front of them and several passing guests who had arrived early for the upcoming harvest gathering, to remove her shoes and scrub the entire length of the marble floor on her hands and knees, insisting that the previous cleaning had left it unsatisfactory. The humiliation was deliberate, calculated, and cruel, delivered with a sweet smile that made it all the more cutting. Eliza felt her face burn as the small gathered audience watched, some with pity, others with the faint amusement of people who had never known what it was to be so thoroughly stripped of dignity in a public space. She had just knelt to begin the task when Nathaniel's voice cut across the hall, sharp and unmistakable with authority. "Stand up, Miss Marlowe." Every head in the hall turned. Nathaniel stood at the top of the staircase, having clearly witnessed the last moments of the scene unfolding below, his expression thunderous in a way none of the household had yet seen from him. Eliza rose slowly, uncertain, as Nathaniel descended the stairs with measured, deliberate steps. "Constance," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "explain to me why a task meant for a mop and brush is being assigned to a woman's bare hands and knees, in front of guests no less." "The floor required proper attention, Nathaniel. I merely instructed. You merely humiliated a member of my staff for the entertainment of onlookers," Nathaniel cut in, his voice cold. "This ends now. Miss Marlowe, you are excused from this task. Return to your regular duties." Eliza hesitated only a moment before curtsying quickly and retreating from the hall, her heart pounding, aware of every eye that followed her departure. Once she was gone, Nathaniel turned his full attention to Constance, and though he kept his voice controlled, there was no mistaking the warning beneath it. "I will not tolerate cruelty in this household, Constance, toward any member of the staff, regardless of your personal feelings toward them. If this happens again, there will be consequences." Constance's face had gone pale with fury and humiliation of her own, standing exposed before the very guests she had hoped would witness Eliza's degradation, instead witnessing her own public rebuke. She said nothing, merely inclining her head stiffly before turning and sweeping from the hall, her mind already racing toward more careful, less visible methods of achieving what open cruelty had failed to accomplish. The household watched the confrontation with wide eyes, and by that evening, whispers of what had happened had spread through every corner of Ashworth Hall, servants and family alike beginning to understand that something had shifted, irrevocably, in the balance of power within these walls. Eliza spent the remainder of the day in a haze, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind replayed the moment Nathaniel had descended the staircase, his voice cutting through the hall with such certainty. No one had ever defended her so openly before, and the strangeness of it sat uneasily alongside a warmth she was not sure she was allowed to feel. That evening, Mrs. Whitfield found her in the small pantry off the kitchen, sitting quietly on an overturned crate during a rare moment of stillness. The older woman studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You gave the household quite a lot to talk about today." "I did nothing, Mrs. Whitfield. I only knelt where I was told to kneel." "That is not what I meant, and you know it." Mrs. Whitfield settled onto a nearby stool with the careful movements of a woman whose joints had spent decades in service to this house. "I have watched Lady Constance rule this household for 3 years, as though she already wore the Duchess's title. I have never once seen anyone stand against her the way the Duke did today." Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the kitchen fires nearby. "I fear it will only make things worse for me, not better. Lady Constance is not a woman who forgets a humiliation." "No," Mrs. Whitfield agreed grimly. "She is not. You would do well to be careful, Eliza. Careful of your tasks, careful of your words, and careful of how much time you spend in the Duke's company, however innocent that time may be. There are those in this house who would delight in seeing you fail, and they will not need much excuse to arrange it." The warning settled heavily over Eliza as she finished her evening duties and retired to the small room she shared with another maid. She lay awake long after the candle had been extinguished, turning over the events of the day, the strange mixture of fear and gratitude that had taken root in her chest since Nathaniel's voice had rung out across the hall. She told herself, as she had told herself every night since his return, that whatever attention he showed her was temporary, born of curiosity about her family's history and perhaps a genuine sense of fairness that made him uncomfortable witnessing cruelty in his own household. She told herself it could not be anything more than that, because anything more was impossible, forbidden by every rule that governed the distance between a duke and a servant, however that servant's family might once have dined at his father's table. But sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, her dreams carried her back to childhood summers in gardens she had not allowed herself to remember in years, sunlight and laughter, and a boy not much older than herself who had once, briefly, shown her the same easy kindness she now saw reflected in a grown man's careful eyes. Nathaniel, for his part, spent that evening in his study once more, though the ledgers and old letters that had occupied his attention for the past weeks sat forgotten on his desk. He found himself instead replaying the moment he had descended the staircase, the fury that had gripped him at the sight of Eliza kneeling on cold marble while guests looked on with idle curiosity or thinly veiled amusement. He had not planned the intensity of his reaction. It had simply overtaken him, a protective anger that surprised him with its force, and he understood now, sitting alone in the quiet of his study, that his interest in Eliza Marlowe had moved well beyond questions of family history and household finances. He was drawn to her, plainly and undeniably, in a way that complicated everything he had assumed about his own future. He had returned to Ashworth Hall expecting to settle matters with Constance eventually, an arrangement long assumed by both families, sensible and convenient in the way such arrangements between titled houses often were. He had never imagined that arrangement would feel, so suddenly, like a cage closing around a life he had not yet chosen to live. He thought of Eliza's steady gaze across his desk, her quiet insistence that she wanted no pity, only fairness. He thought of her father's letters, of a friendship between families that had once seemed destined to endure, before fortune and dishonest men had torn it apart. And he thought, with a clarity that unsettled him, that he did not want his growing feelings for her to remain a secret he carried alone in the privacy of his study. But he was not naive about the dangers such feelings carried, not only for himself but far more severely for her. A duke's infatuation with a servant, however sincere, could easily become the very weapon Constance needed to destroy the one thing Eliza had left, her position, her livelihood, her small measure of safety, in a world that had already taken everything else from her. He resolved, sitting alone in the candlelight, that whatever he chose to do next, he would move carefully. He would not allow his own feelings to become the instrument of her ruin. Outside his window, the harvest-gathering preparations continued in the gardens below, torches being tested along the pathways for the following week's celebration, and somewhere within the sprawling house, two people who had once played together as children now lay awake in separate rooms, each turning over the same impossible, dangerous hope, neither yet brave enough to speak it aloud. The harvest gathering brought half the county's notable families to Ashworth Hall, and with them came the kind of talk that spread through drawing rooms far faster than any servant could carry a tray. By the second day of festivities, Eliza could feel the weight of curious glances following her through the corridors, guests who had heard whispered versions of the staircase incident and now studied her with open interest whenever she passed. She kept her head down and her duties precise, hoping the novelty would fade once the guests departed and the household returned to its ordinary rhythm. But Constance had other plans, and she pursued them with a patience that made her far more dangerous than any outburst of temper could have been. It began quietly. A missing brooch reported by one of the visiting ladies, a piece of jewelry last seen, according to Constance's careful account, in the room where Eliza had been sent to freshen the linens that same morning. By the time the accusation reached Nathaniel's ears, it had already traveled through half the guest list, embellished with suggestions that the household staff could not always be trusted, that recent leniency toward certain servants had perhaps invited a certain boldness. Nathaniel found Eliza in the servants' hall that evening, her face pale and her hands trembling as she folded napkins for the following day's breakfast service. Mrs. Whitfield stood nearby, her expression grim. "I did not take it, Your Grace," Eliza said the moment she saw him, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I swear to you, I never touched the lady's jewelry box. I only changed the linens and left." "I believe you," Nathaniel said simply, and the certainty in his voice steadied her slightly. "But belief alone will not silence the accusation. I need to understand exactly what happened in that room." Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward. "Your Grace, if I may, I assigned Eliza to that room myself, and I checked her work not 20 minutes after she finished. I saw no jewelry box left carelessly open, no sign of anything amiss. If the brooch is truly missing, it went missing after Eliza had already left the room." "Who else had access to that room in the time between?" Nathaniel asked. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, glancing briefly toward the corridor before lowering her voice. "Lady Constance's own maid was seen near that wing shortly after, Your Grace, though I did not think much of it at the time. She often moves between the guest rooms on errands for her mistress." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The pattern was becoming unmistakable, each accusation against Eliza tracing back, however indirectly, to someone within Constance's immediate circle. He did not yet have proof enough to confront his cousin directly, but the suspicion hardened into something close to certainty. "Say nothing of this to the guests," he instructed both women. "I will handle the matter quietly and directly. Eliza, continue your duties as though nothing has happened. I do not want Constance to see that her accusation has struck its mark." Eliza nodded, though the fear did not leave her eyes entirely. "And if it does strike its mark, Your Grace, if I am dismissed regardless of the truth?" "You will not be dismissed," Nathaniel said, with a firmness that left no room for doubt, "not while I have breath to prevent it." The words settled something in her chest, though the danger of her position remained sharply clear. A duke's protection could shield her from immediate dismissal, but it could not erase the growing talk among the guests, nor could it undo the damage such talk might do to her reputation, a reputation that was, in the end, all a woman in her position truly possessed. Over the following 2 days, Nathaniel worked quietly to trace the missing brooch, questioning staff discreetly, reviewing who had passed through the guest wing during the relevant hours. His efforts eventually led him to a young footman who, under careful and private questioning, admitted to seeing Constance's maid slip something small into her apron pocket while passing through the corridor outside the guest room in question. Armed with this information, Nathaniel confronted Constance privately in her sitting room, laying out what he had learned with measured, deliberate calm. "Your maid was seen taking something from that room, Constance. I believe the brooch was never stolen by anyone on my staff. I believe it was removed deliberately to manufacture an accusation against Eliza." Constance's composure cracked only slightly, a flicker of alarm before she recovered her footing. "That is a serious accusation, Nathaniel, based on nothing more than a footman's word." "It is based on a pattern, Constance, a pattern that began with a vase you claimed Eliza broke, though I have since learned it was your own sleeve that struck it. A pattern that continued with humiliating tasks assigned specifically when I was likely to witness them. And now a missing brooch that conveniently implicates the one servant in this house you have made clear you wish to see removed. You are choosing to believe a servant over your own family," Constance said, her voice rising with genuine anger now. "Have you forgotten every obligation you carry, Nathaniel? The understanding between our families? I have managed this household faithfully for years, and you would throw that aside for a passing fascination with a girl who empties chamber pots." "I have thrown nothing aside," Nathaniel said, his voice hardening. "I am simply refusing to allow injustice to continue under my own roof. Whatever understanding once existed between our families was never a formal engagement, Constance, and you know that as well as I do. I will not be bound to an arrangement built on cruelty toward the innocent." Constance stared at him for a long moment, something calculating settling behind her eyes even as her voice softened into something more pleading. "Nathaniel, please, think of what you risk. If word spreads that the Duke of Ashworth has taken a personal interest in a housemaid, the damage to this family's standing could be severe. Think of your responsibilities, to the title, to our family's long history together." "I have thought of little else these past weeks," Nathaniel replied. "And I have concluded that a title built on cruelty is not a title worth protecting at the expense of what is right." He left her sitting room without waiting for further argument, though the confrontation left him unsettled in ways he had not anticipated. He had not intended to declare his feelings so openly, even indirectly, and he wondered now whether his words had given Constance more ammunition rather than less. His concerns proved well-founded within days. Rather than retreating, Constance shifted her strategy entirely, turning her attention not toward manufacturing further accusations against Eliza directly, but toward cultivating gossip among the departing guests. Careful, pointed remarks dropped in conversation about the Duke's unusual attachment to a member of his household staff, remarks calculated to spread through county society long after the harvest gathering had ended. By the time the last guests departed Ashworth Hall, the story had already begun to travel, embellished and reshaped with each retelling, until it reached even the ears of families who had never set foot on the estate. Whispers of a Duke infatuated with a servant girl became, within a fortnight, a scandal discussed openly at dinner tables across the county, threatening not only Eliza's position, but Nathaniel's standing among his peers. Eliza felt the shift keenly, even within the walls of Ashworth Hall itself. Staff who had once treated her with quiet sympathy now regarded her with wary distance, unwilling to be associated too closely with a source of such dangerous attention. She overheard, more than once, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, and the isolation of it weighed on her more heavily than any single act of cruelty had managed to do. One evening, unable to bear the weight of it any longer, she sought out Nathaniel in his study, finding him bent over correspondence that had arrived from London, his expression tired in a way she had not seen since his return. "Your Grace, I must speak with you." He looked up immediately, setting aside his letters. "Eliza, what is it?" "I think I should leave Ashworth Hall." The words came out steadier than she felt saying them. "The talk has grown too dangerous, for both of us. I will not be the cause of scandal that damages your standing, your family's reputation. I have some small savings. I can find a position elsewhere, somewhere far enough that the talk will not follow me." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, and he softened his tone immediately, though his conviction did not waver. "I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself for gossip that was never your fault to begin with. This is my household, my responsibility, and I will not solve it by driving away the one person in it who has done nothing wrong. But the scandal exists because my cousin manufactured it, deliberately and cruelly, to protect her own ambitions," Nathaniel said. "I will not reward that cruelty by allowing it to succeed. You belong here, Eliza, as much as anyone in this house, perhaps more than most." Eliza's eyes filled with tears she had not expected, exhaustion and gratitude and something deeper mingling together until she could no longer distinguish one feeling from another. "I do not understand why you would risk so much for me." Nathaniel rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the sincerity plain in his expression. "I think you understand more than you are willing to admit," he said quietly. "Just as I have understood for some time now, that what I feel toward you has moved well beyond concern for fairness or curiosity about your family's history." The words hung between them, unfinished but unmistakable in their meaning, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid pressing against the quiet study like a held breath waiting to be released. It was Eliza who finally broke the silence, stepping back with visible effort, though the color had risen high in her cheeks. "Your Grace, whatever you feel, however sincere, cannot change what I am. A servant, a woman with no fortune, no standing, nothing to offer a man of your position beyond the shame of association. If word of this reaches beyond idle gossip, if it becomes something people believe rather than merely whisper, the damage would be far greater than anything Lady Constance has managed so far." "I am aware of the risks," Nathaniel said. "I have thought of little else these past weeks. But I find I am no longer willing to let fear of scandal dictate the whole of my life, particularly when the alternative is a marriage built on obligation rather than genuine regard." "You speak as though the choice were simple," Eliza said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. "It is not simple, Your Grace, not for you, and certainly not for me. I have spent 3 years learning to survive in this house by remaining invisible, by asking for nothing, by expecting nothing. I do not know how to want something as impossible as what you seem to be suggesting. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, understanding the fear beneath her words. A fear built not from doubt in her own feelings but from hard experience of a world that had already taken everything from her once before. He did not press further, recognizing that whatever existed between them could not be rushed into being through a single conversation, however honest. I will not ask you to want anything you are not ready to want, he said gently. I only ask that you not leave Ashworth Hall out of fear for my sake. Let me handle Constance, and the gossip, and whatever consequences follow. That is my responsibility to carry, not yours. Eliza nodded slowly, though the uncertainty had not fully left her expression. I will stay for now, but please, Your Grace, be careful. Lady Constance is not a woman who accepts defeat gracefully, and I fear she has not yet exhausted her methods. Her words proved prescient sooner than either of them expected. Within days, Constance shifted her approach once more. No longer content with cultivating gossip from a distance, she began appearing wherever Eliza worked, offering pointed comments disguised as pleasantries, small cruelties delivered with a smile that left no obvious mark but wore steadily at Eliza's composure all the same. Worse still, Edmund had begun making inquiries of his own, quietly gathering information about the Marlowe family's collapse years earlier, searching for any detail that might be twisted into further scandal or leverage. He found, buried in old county records, mention of the business partner whose dishonesty had ruined Charles Marlowe, a man named Frederick Ashcombe, still living, still respected in certain circles, and Edmund began to see in this discovery a potential weapon far more dangerous than any accusation of theft. He brought his findings to Constance one evening, laying out his plan with the careful satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally found the solution his cousin had been seeking. If we can arrange for Ashcombe to make certain claims, publicly, about the circumstances of the Marlowe family's downfall, claims that suggest impropriety on Charles Marlowe's part rather than simple misfortune, it would destroy whatever sympathy Nathaniel holds for the girl. No man wants to align himself, even secretly, with the daughter of a disgraced criminal. Constance's eyes lit with cold interest at the suggestion. And if Ashcombe requires persuasion to make such claims? Men like Ashcombe can always be persuaded, Edmund said, provided the incentive is sufficient. The two of them began laying their plans with grim determination, unaware that their scheming had already been noticed by more careful eyes than they realized. Mrs. Whitfield, who had spent decades learning to read the currents of this household long before they surfaced openly, had grown increasingly watchful of both Constance and Edmund in recent weeks, and she resolved, quietly, to keep her own inquiries running alongside theirs, determined to protect the young woman she had come to regard with something close to maternal concern. The invitation to the autumn assembly at Ashworth Hall had been sent weeks earlier, a formal gathering meant to reintroduce Nathaniel to county society, following his long absence abroad. By the time the evening arrived, Constance and Edmund had spent their preparations on far more than seating arrangements and menu selections. Frederick Ashcombe arrived among the guests that evening, an older man with silvering hair and the practiced charm of someone accustomed to moving comfortably through rooms full of people who did not know the full extent of his history. Few among the gathered guests recognized his name or connected it to any scandal from years past, but Constance had made certain he understood exactly what was expected of him that night, and the sum promised for his cooperation had been more than sufficient to secure it. Eliza moved through the edges of the gathering that evening as she always did during such occasions, carrying trays, refilling glasses, present but unseen by most of the assembled company. She had grown accustomed, over the preceding weeks, to a wary vigilance whenever Constance or Edmund were near, though tonight, amid the noise and bright candlelight of the assembly, she allowed herself a small measure of relief that the evening seemed, so far, to be passing without incident. That relief shattered just past 9 o'clock, when Constance, with theatrical timing that betrayed careful planning, raised her voice during a lull in conversation near the center of the ballroom, addressing Frederick Ashcombe directly, in a tone pitched to Carrie. Mr. Ashcombe, I understand you were acquainted with a man named Charles Marlowe some years past. I wonder if you might share with our guests what became of that unfortunate business arrangement between you. A ripple of curious attention spread through the nearby guests, and Nathaniel, standing across the room in conversation with a neighboring landowner, felt a cold premonition settle over him, even before Ashcombe began to speak. Ah, yes, poor Marlowe, Ashcombe said, shaking his head with practiced sorrow. A sad affair. He approached me some years ago with an investment scheme, promising returns that, in hindsight, should have raised more suspicion than they did. When the venture collapsed, He claimed innocence, insisted I had misled him, though the truth, as I understood it, was rather the opposite. He had gambled recklessly with funds not entirely his own to gamble with, and when the losses came due, he preferred to paint himself the victim rather than accept the consequences of his own poor judgment. The words landed among the assembled guests like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of shocked murmuring spreading outward. Nathaniel crossed the room quickly, his expression thunderous, but the damage was already unfolding in real time. Guests turning to one another with raised eyebrows, the story of a disgraced gentleman farmer taking on new and uglier shape with each passing whisper. "That is a lie," Eliza's voice rang out, unexpectedly steady despite the tremor of fury beneath it. She had stepped forward from the edge of the room, abandoning the tray she carried, no longer able to remain silent while her father's memory was slandered before a room full of strangers. "My father was an honest man. He was deceived, not deceiving. I was there, Mr. Ashcombe. I was young, but I remember enough to know that you visited our home in the months before the collapse, promising my father returns on investments that never existed, urging him to commit funds he could not afford to lose." The room fell into stunned silence at the sight of a housemaid speaking so boldly and directly to an invited guest. Constance's expression flickered with satisfaction, believing the scene was unfolding precisely as she had intended, a servant's outburst that would only confirm her lack of proper breeding and further damage whatever regard the Duke held for her. But Nathaniel, arriving at the center of the confrontation, did not reprimand Eliza. Instead, he turned to Ashcombe with an expression of cold, controlled fury that silenced the murmuring guests more effectively than any raised voice could have managed. "Mr. Ashcombe," he said, "it happens that I have spent the past several weeks reviewing old family correspondence, including letters my own father exchanged with Charles Marlowe in the final years of his life. My father, who knew both men personally, wrote quite clearly of his suspicion that you had defrauded Marlowe deliberately, urging him at the time to pursue legal recourse, though Marlowe's declining health prevented him from doing so before his death." Ashcombe's confident expression faltered for the first time. "Your Grace, I assure you, whatever your father believed." "My father was not a man given to idle speculation," Nathaniel continued, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "And I find it curious, Mr. Ashcombe, that you would choose tonight, of all nights, at my cousin's specific invitation, to revisit an affair concluded years ago and long since forgotten by county society. I wonder what incentive might have prompted such timing." The implication hung heavy in the air, and several guests turned their attention now not to Eliza or Ashcombe, but to Constance, whose careful composure had begun, for the first time that evening, to crack visibly. "Nathaniel, I only thought it relevant, given the household's recent talk." "Given the household's recent talk," Nathaniel repeated, turning to face her fully now, "which you yourself cultivated, deliberately and repeatedly, since the moment my attention first fell on Miss Marlowe's unjust treatment in this very house. I have been patient, Constance, hoping you might abandon these schemes on your own. I see now that patience was misplaced." He turned back to address the assembled guests, his voice steady and clear enough that no one in the ballroom could claim afterward to have misunderstood his meaning. "I would like to clarify, for everyone present, the truth of the matter you have all just witnessed unfold. Eliza Marlowe is the daughter of a man my own father counted among his closest friends, a family whose ruin was caused not by dishonesty or poor character, but by the deliberate fraud of a man who stands before you tonight, evidently still willing to profit from that same deception years later, at the encouragement of my cousin, whose motives I believe were rather less concerned with truth than with protecting her own ambitions in this household." Gasps rippled through the ballroom, and Constance's face had gone entirely white, the careful mask of composure she had maintained for years finally, publicly, shattering under the weight of exposure. "You cannot mean to take her word, a servant's word, over the concerns of your own family," Constance said, her voice rising with genuine desperation now. "I do not take her word alone," Nathaniel said. "I take my father's word, recorded in his own hand, which corroborates every claim she has made tonight, and I take the word of my own observations these past weeks, watching you manufacture cruelty after cruelty against a woman whose only crime was surviving misfortune with more dignity than you have ever managed to show in comfort." He turned then to face Eliza directly, and though the entire ballroom watched with rapt, breathless attention, he did not lower his voice or soften the moment for privacy. "Miss Marlowe, I owe you a public apology for every indignity you have suffered under this roof. Indignities I was too slow to fully understand and prevent. Your father's name deserves to be spoken with the respect it was always due, and I intend to see that respect restored, beginning tonight." Eliza stood frozen at the center of the room, overwhelmed by the sudden, complete reversal of everything she had endured for 3 long years, the public vindication arriving with a force that left her breathless and trembling. Edmund, watching from the edge of the gathering, understood immediately that whatever scheme he and Constance had constructed lay in ruins, and he made a quiet, calculated decision to distance himself from his cousin's collapsing position, slipping toward the doors before Nathaniel's attention could turn fully in his direction. But Nathaniel had not forgotten him. "Edmund," he called, his voice carrying across the room before his cousin could escape entirely. "I would speak with you as well, regarding your own role in tonight's events, and in the theft of a certain brooch some weeks past, which I believe your inquiries into the Marlowe family were meant to distract attention from." Edmund stopped, his shoulders sagging with the recognition that flight would only confirm his guilt more thoroughly than remaining might. The remainder of the evening unfolded in a haze for Eliza, guests departing in stunned clusters, whispering not of scandal now but of the remarkable scene they had witnessed, a duke's public defense of a wronged servant, a cousin's schemes exposed before the entire county. Mrs. Whitfield appeared at her side at some point, guiding her gently from the ballroom to a quieter room where she could finally allow the trembling in her hands to show freely, tears of exhaustion and disbelief finally spilling over now that the performance of composure was no longer required. Nathaniel found her there sometime later, the ballroom finally emptied of its guests, Constance having retreated to her rooms in humiliated silence, Ashcombe having fled the estate entirely before any further consequence could be arranged for him. "I am sorry," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "I should have found a gentler way to expose the truth, rather than allowing it to unfold before an entire room of strangers." "No," Eliza said, wiping at her eyes, though a small, disbelieving smile had begun to form despite everything. "No, I think perhaps it needed to happen exactly as it did. My father's name has been cleared, publicly, before the very society that once shunned our family without ever knowing the full truth. I do not think a quiet, private correction would have accomplished what tonight accomplished." Nathaniel reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. "There will be more talk tomorrow, and in the days after," he said. "Not the cruel talk of before, I think, but talk nonetheless, of a duke and a housemaid, and what tonight might mean for both of us." "Let them talk," Eliza said. And for the first time since she had come to Ashworth Hall 3 years before, there was no fear in the words, only a tired, hopeful certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Before the household could fully retire for the night, Nathaniel called Edmund into his study for the confrontation he had promised in front of the departing guests. Edmund arrived pale and subdued, all traces of his usual careless confidence stripped away by the evening's events. "I want the truth," Nathaniel said, without preamble. "The brooch, the scheme with Ashcombe, all of it. I already have enough evidence to ruin you if I choose to pursue it formally, so consider this your only opportunity to account for yourself honestly." Edmund sank into the chair across from the desk, his shoulders bowed. It was Constance's idea, the brooch. She wanted a reason to see Eliza dismissed before matters between you progressed any further. I arranged for her maid to take it and hide it among Eliza's belongings, though in the end the plan fell apart when Mrs. Whitfield vouched too firmly for her whereabouts. "And Ashcombe? That was mine," Edmund admitted quietly. "I found record of the old scandal in the county archives, and thought it might discredit the Marlowe name thoroughly enough to end your interest in her entirely. Constance paid Ashcombe generously to make the claims tonight. I did not expect you to have your father's letters to counter him so completely." Nathaniel studied his cousin with a mixture of disappointment and weary resignation. "You have always resented that the title passed to me rather than to your branch of the family, Edmund. I understand that resentment, even if I do not excuse what you have done because of it. But conspiring to destroy an innocent woman's reputation, and mine along with it, out of that resentment, is beyond anything I am willing to overlook quietly." "What will you do?" Edmund asked, his voice tight with genuine fear now. "I will not have you prosecuted, for the sake of what remains of this family's dignity," Nathaniel said. "But you will leave Ashworth Hall by the end of the week, and you will not return while I hold this title. Whatever allowance you have received from this estate ends as of tonight. You will need to find your own way in the world from here forward, as many honest men before you have managed to do without the benefit of a title's protection." Edmund left the study without further argument, understanding that he had escaped far more lightly than his actions warranted, and by the following week, true to Nathaniel's word, his belongings had been packed and his rooms at Ashworth Hall stood empty. Constance's reckoning came the following morning, delivered not with the fury of the previous night but with the quiet, exhausted finality of a man who had simply run out of patience for his cousin's schemes. He found her in the small parlor where she had first raised her suspicions about Eliza weeks earlier, her eyes red from a night spent weeping over her ruined position. "I have decided you will remain welcome to visit Ashworth Hall as family, Constance, provided your future conduct warrants such welcome," he said, his voice level. "But your management of this household ends today. I will be appointing new arrangements for the estate's daily affairs, and I would ask that you return to your family's own estate within the fortnight, to consider carefully how you wish to conduct yourself going forward." "You are casting me out," Constance said bitterly, "for the sake of a servant. I am removing you from a position of authority you abused repeatedly and cruelly," Nathaniel corrected. "What happens between myself and Miss Marlowe is a separate matter entirely, one I do not owe you further explanation for. You built your own downfall tonight, Constance, through choices that were entirely your own to make or avoid." She left Ashworth Hall 3 days later, her departure marked by none of the fanfare that had once surrounded her presumed position as future Duchess, and though whispers of her schemes would follow her for some time in county society, she offered no public defense, understanding perhaps better than anyone the thoroughness of her own exposure. In the days that followed, Ashworth Hall settled into an unfamiliar quiet, the household adjusting to the sudden absence of the tension that had gripped its halls for weeks. Eliza found herself treated differently by the staff now, not with the wary distance of before, but with a genuine warmth that had been carefully hidden beneath years of caution about associating too closely with someone who drew the family's disapproval. Mrs. Whitfield, in particular, seemed to soften visibly in the days after the assembly, finding small excuses to check on Eliza throughout her duties, offering the kind of quiet approval she had withheld carefully during the years when such approval might have drawn unwanted attention. "You have earned this," the housekeeper told her one afternoon, watching Eliza work with something like pride in her expression. "Whatever comes next for you, know that you earned it through your own strength, not simply through the Duke's favor." Eliza held those words close in the weeks that followed, uncertain still of exactly what shape her future might take, but grateful, for the first time in 3 long years, that the future held genuine possibility, rather than merely the grim endurance she had grown accustomed to expecting. Nathaniel, too, found himself changed by the events of that autumn night. The weight of obligation he had once carried toward an arrangement with Constance, replaced now by a lighter, clearer sense of his own direction. He spent long hours walking the estate's gardens in the evenings that followed, the same gardens where, he now knew, a young Eliza Marlowe had once run freely as an honored guest, and he found himself imagining, with growing certainty, a future in which she might walk those same paths again, not as a servant tolerated by circumstance, but as someone with every right to claim them as her own. He said nothing of these thoughts to her directly, in the days immediately following the assembly, understanding that she needed time to steady herself after the sudden upheaval of public vindication, time to trust that the ground beneath her had truly shifted, and was not merely another cruel illusion destined to collapse. But he watched her closely during those weeks, noting the way her shoulders had begun to straighten, the way laughter had started to return to her voice during quiet moments in the servants' hall, and he allowed himself, cautiously, to hope that what had begun as curiosity and grown into protectiveness might yet become something neither of them would need to hide or apologize for. The county, for its part, continued to speak of the autumn assembly for weeks afterward, though the tone of the talk had shifted entirely from scandal to something closer to fascination, a story of injustice exposed and cruelty punished that seemed to capture the imagination of everyone who heard even a fragment of it. And at the center of that story, quietly going about her daily work within the walls of Ashworth Hall, Eliza Marlowe began, for the first time since her father's ruin, to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. Winter settled over Ashworth Hall with a quiet gentleness that felt, to Eliza, like an entirely different house than the one she had known for the past 3 years. The frost that crept across the window panes each morning no longer carried the same chill of dread it once had, and the long corridors that had felt like a maze of hidden dangers now simply felt like home, in a way she had not allowed herself to admit until Constance's departure had made such feelings safe to hold. She still rose before dawn each day, still carried out her duties with the same careful diligence she always had, though the nature of those duties had shifted in ways the household could not help but notice. Mrs. Whitfield, now given far greater authority over the estate's daily management with Constance gone, had quietly begun assigning Eliza tasks that required more skill and discretion, overseeing certain correspondence, managing small accounts, responsibilities that reflected a growing trust the older woman had clearly decided Eliza had long since earned. Nathaniel, for his part, had spent the weeks since the autumn assembly rebuilding the estate's finances and reputation with the same careful determination he had once applied to uncovering the truth of Eliza's family history. He had written formally to several of his father's old acquaintances, restoring, as best he could, the Marlowe name to the respect it had once held before Ashcombe's fraud had stripped it away. Word had begun to spread, slowly but steadily, that Charles Marlowe's ruin had been the result of deception rather than dishonesty. And Eliza found herself, for the first time in years, greeted by occasional visitors to the estate not with pity or curiosity, but with something closer to quiet respect. It was on a cold evening in early December, snow falling steadily outside the tall windows of the drawing room, that Nathaniel finally found the courage to say plainly what he had carried, carefully guarded, since the night of the assembly. He had asked Eliza to join him in the drawing room after her duties concluded, a request unusual enough that she arrived uncertain what to expect, though the warmth in his expression when she entered eased some of her nervousness immediately. "I have spent the past months trying to be patient," he said, once she had settled into the chair across from him, the fire crackling steadily between them. "Patient in giving you time to trust that the changes in this house were real and lasting. Patient in not rushing you toward feelings you were not ready to name. But I find, tonight, that my patience has reached its limit." Eliza's heart quickened, though she said nothing, waiting. "I love you," Nathaniel said simply, the words carrying none of the formal hesitation she might have expected from a man of his station addressing such a declaration to a servant. "I have loved you, I think, since the night I watched you kneel on that marble floor, with more dignity than I had ever witnessed from anyone, of any station. I do not want an arrangement built on obligation, as I once nearly accepted with Constance. I want a marriage built on the kind of respect and affection I have watched grow between us these past months, however unconventional that choice might appear to the world beyond these walls." Eliza's breath caught, tears rising unbidden as 3 years of careful, guarded self-protection finally began to loosen their hold on her heart. "You would face the scandal of it, truly. A duke marrying a housemaid, whatever her father's former standing may have been. The talk would follow us for years, perhaps our entire lives." "Let it follow us," Nathaniel said, echoing the very words she had spoken to him months earlier, a small, knowing smile touching his expression. "I have already weathered scandal for your sake once, and found I did not mind it nearly as much as I once feared I would. I would rather weather a lifetime of whispered talk beside a woman I love, than spend that same lifetime bound to convention and quiet misery." "I love you as well," Eliza admitted, the words trembling slightly but certain. "I have loved you, I think, since long before I allowed myself to acknowledge it, since the moment you asked whether my hand was bleeding, when no one in this house had ever asked me such a simple human question before." Nathaniel crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands gently in his own. "Eliza Marlowe, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not as an act of charity, not as a correction of old injustice, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life beside anyone else." "Yes," she said, and the single word carried within it 3 years of grief and survival, and now, finally, the beginning of something she had never dared to hope she might one day claim for herself. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." The engagement, when announced formally to the household and eventually to the wider county, brought exactly the storm of talk both of them had anticipated, drawing rooms across the region buzzing with astonishment at the news that the Duke of Ashworth intended to marry a former housemaid, however respectable her family's history had once been. But the story of Constance's schemes and Ashcombe's fraud had already spread widely enough that much of county society approached the news with curiosity, rather than outright condemnation, the drama of the autumn assembly having already primed them to view Eliza as a figure of sympathy rather than scandal. Mrs. Whitfield wept openly when Eliza shared the news with her privately, the older woman's stern composure finally breaking entirely, as she embraced the young woman she had quietly protected and guided through 3 difficult years of service. "I always believed there was more to you than this house allowed you to show," Mrs. Whitfield said, wiping at her eyes. "I am only glad I lived to see it recognized properly, at last." The wedding took place in early spring, held in the small chapel on the Ashworth estate grounds rather than the grand cathedral setting more typical of ducal marriages, a choice Nathaniel and Eliza made together, wanting the day to feel intimate rather than a spectacle for county society to consume. The household staff, given a rare day free from their usual duties, attended as honored guests rather than servants for the occasion, and Mrs. Whitfield sat in a place of honor near the front, tears streaming freely as she watched the ceremony unfold. Eliza wore a simple gown of pale blue, nothing so grand as county society might have expected of a duchess's wedding attire, but the simplicity suited her, and as she walked toward Nathaniel at the front of the small chapel, she felt, for the first time since her father's death years before, that she was walking not away from her old life but back toward the one that had always, rightfully, belonged to her. Charles Marlowe's memory was honored during the ceremony as well, Nathaniel having arranged for a small plaque to be placed near the chapel entrance, commemorating the friendship between their two families that had once flourished before fraud and misfortune had torn it apart, a quiet acknowledgement that the love uniting Nathaniel and Eliza had roots reaching back further than either of them had initially understood. As the ceremony concluded and the small gathering of guests spilled out into the mild spring afternoon, Eliza found herself standing beside Nathaniel at the edge of the gardens where, she now knew, she had once run as a child during summer visits she barely remembered. Gardens that had witnessed both the beginning and the restoration of everything her family had once possessed. "Do you remember these gardens at all?" Nathaniel asked, watching her expression as she looked out over the familiar grounds with new eyes. "Only in fragments," Eliza admitted. "Sunlight, and laughter, and the smell of these very roses in bloom. I did not know, until your father's letters, that those fragments were real memories, rather than simply dreams I had invented to comfort myself during the hardest years." Nathaniel drew her closer, the spring breeze carrying the scent of blooming roses around them just as it must have, all those years ago, during summers neither of them had ever expected to reclaim. "Then let us make new memories here, together, memories neither of us will ever need to question the reality of." Eliza smiled, leaning into him with a contentment that had once felt entirely beyond her reach. 3 years of servitude and grief, finally giving way to a future built not on charity or pity, but on genuine, hard-won love, recognized at last by the very household that had once seen nothing in her but an invisible servant. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Eliza had faced her own quiet anxieties about stepping into a role so far removed from anything she had imagined for herself. She had spent 3 years learning the rhythms of service, learning to make herself small and unremarkable in rooms where her presence had once been unwelcome. Becoming a duchess required learning an entirely different set of rhythms, and though Nathaniel assured her repeatedly that her natural intelligence and grace would carry her through whatever challenges society presented, Eliza found herself grateful for Mrs. Whitfield's steady guidance during those transitional months. "You already know this house better than any duchess who married in from outside ever could," Mrs. Whitfield told her one afternoon, helping her review the household ledgers that would soon fall under her authority as lady of the estate. "You know which servants work hardest and which corners get neglected when no one is watching. You know the true cost of running this house, not merely the figures written in a ledger. That knowledge will serve you better than any finishing school ever could have." The other staff, too, embraced the change with a warmth that surprised Eliza at every turn. The younger maids who had once kept a careful, wary distance during the height of Constance's cruelty, now sought her out eagerly, asking her advice, treating her with the easy familiarity of someone who had once walked in their shoes and understood their daily struggles intimately. Rather than creating distance between herself and the staff she had once served alongside, Eliza found that her history only deepened the household's loyalty and affection toward her, a lady who understood, from hard experience, exactly what it meant to serve and to be overlooked. News of Constance's fate reached Ashworth Hall only occasionally in the months following her departure, filtered through the careful, gossiping channels of county correspondence. She had retreated to her family's smaller estate some distance away, her reputation sufficiently damaged by the revelations of the autumn assembly that the marriage prospects she had once taken for granted grew considerably more limited. Nathaniel felt no particular satisfaction in this outcome, though he acknowledged, privately to Eliza, that he felt no great sympathy for it either, understanding it as the natural consequence of choices Constance had made freely and repeatedly. Edmund's path proved rockier still. Without the allowance he had grown accustomed to receiving from the Ashworth estate, he was forced to seek employment for the first time in his life, eventually securing a modest position managing accounts for a merchant family in a distant town, a humbling come-down for a man who had once assumed he would live comfortably off family connections indefinitely. Word reached Ashworth Hall, some months after the wedding, that he had at least proven capable and diligent in his new position, a small measure of redemption that Nathaniel chose to view with cautious optimism rather than lingering resentment. As spring gave way to summer, Eliza settled fully into her role as Duchess, and the estate flourished under the combined attention she and Nathaniel devoted to it. She took particular interest in the welfare of the household staff, implementing small changes that improved their daily conditions in ways her own years of service had taught her mattered far more than any grand gesture might have. Better meals during long working days, fairer distribution of difficult tasks, and a standing invitation for any member of staff to bring grievances directly to her, without fear of the dismissive treatment she herself had once endured. The tenant farmers on the estate's surrounding lands noticed the change as well, finding in their new duchess someone who understood, in ways few of her predecessors had, the genuine hardships of agricultural life and the precariousness of livelihoods dependent on a single season's harvest. She advocated successfully for fairer rents during a difficult year, when late frost damaged much of the local crop, earning a genuine, lasting affection among the tenant families that would follow her for the rest of her life at Ashworth Hall. Nathaniel watched these changes unfold with quiet pride, understanding that the woman he had married brought to her new position not merely grace and intelligence, but a genuine, hard-won empathy that transformed the estate in ways he could never have accomplished alone. Their partnership, built on the foundation of shared adversity and mutual respect, grew steadily deeper with each passing season, weathering the inevitable challenges of managing a large estate together, with the same resilience that had first drawn them to one another during the difficult months of Eliza's public vindication. By the time autumn returned to Ashworth Hall, exactly 1 year after the assembly that had changed both their lives so irrevocably, the county had largely settled into comfortable acceptance of their unconventional match. The scandal that once threatened to define their story, replaced instead by admiration for a duchess whose journey from servitude to nobility had become something of a local legend, retold with increasing warmth at dinner tables across the region. The household staff watched from a respectful distance as the new Duke and Duchess walked together through the gardens on the anniversary of their wedding, and among them, whispered quietly between two young maids who had joined the household only recently, was a simple observation that would come to define how the county remembered the story for years afterward. "Everyone saw her as just a servant," one of them murmured, watching the couple disappear among the rose bushes, until the Duke called her his lady. That evening, as the sun set behind the low hills beyond the estate, Nathaniel and Eliza sat together on a bench near the very spot where the roses grew thickest, the same bench they had come to learn from an old gardener still employed on the estate, where Charles Marlowe and the late Duke had once sat together during those long-ago summers, discussing crops and politics and the future while their children ran laughing through the grass nearby. "I used to wonder," Eliza said quietly, watching the last light fade over the gardens, "whether I would ever stop feeling like an intruder in my own life, whether some part of me would always expect the ground to shift beneath me again, the way it did when my father died and everything I knew disappeared within a single terrible year." "And now?" Nathaniel asked, taking her hand in his. "Now I think I have finally stopped waiting for the ground to shift," she said, resting her head against his shoulder. "I think, for the first time since I was a girl running through these very gardens, I finally feel as though I belong exactly where I am standing." They sat together as darkness settled fully over the estate, the lights of Ashworth Hall glowing warmly in the distance. A house that had once been the site of Eliza's deepest humiliation now standing as the home where she had finally found the belonging she had spent 3 long years believing was lost to her forever. And though the county would continue to tell and retell the story of the servant who became a lady for generations afterward, embellishing details here and softening others there as such stories inevitably do with time, the truth at its heart remained simple and unchanged. Two people who had found, in each other, a partnership built not on title or convenience, but on the rare and lasting foundation of genuine respect, hard-won trust, and love that had proven strong enough to withstand every scheme devised to destroy it. 5 years had passed since the autumn assembly that changed the course of 2 lives forever, and Ashworth Hall had grown, in that time, into a very different house than the one Eliza Marlowe had once entered as a frightened, penniless young woman seeking any position that might keep her from starvation. She stood now in the same drawing room where Constance had once humiliated her over a broken vase, though the room itself had been transformed along with everything else about her life within these walls. New curtains hung at the windows, chosen by her own hand. A portrait of her father, painstakingly located and restored from among the few possessions that had survived the family's collapse years earlier, hung now beside a matching portrait of Nathaniel's own father, 2 old friends reunited at last upon the walls of a house that had once seemed determined to erase all memory of their friendship. A small child's laughter echoed from the hallway outside, and Eliza smiled, recognizing the sound of her daughter, now 3 years old, chasing after one of the household's gentle old hunting dogs with the same fearless energy that Eliza herself had apparently once displayed during her own childhood visits to these gardens. Young Charlotte Ashworth, named for the grandfather she would never know but whose memory had been so carefully restored to honor within these walls, had grown into a bright, curious child who split her time between the formal expectations of her position and the genuine warmth of a household staff who adored her without reservation. Nathaniel entered the drawing room a few moments later, catching Eliza's hand and pressing a light kiss to it in the easy, affectionate manner that had become so natural between them over the years that neither of them thought twice about such small gestures anymore. "Mrs. Whitfield tells me Charlotte has convinced half the kitchen staff to help her build some manner of fortress out of flour sacks," he said, amusement evident in his voice. "I confess I am almost afraid to investigate the full extent of the damage." "Let her have her fortress," Eliza laughed. "She will grow up soon enough into the more serious business of managing an estate. Let her enjoy being a child a little longer first." Their household had grown in more ways than one over the years. Mrs. Whitfield, now well into her later years, had gradually transitioned much of her daily authority to a capable young housekeeper she had personally trained, though she remained a beloved fixture of the estate, spending her days now in a comfortable cottage on the grounds that Nathaniel and Eliza had insisted on providing her, a small gesture of gratitude for decades of quiet loyalty and protection that neither of them would ever forget. The estate's tenant farmers had prospered considerably under Eliza's continued advocacy, fair rents and improved conditions having transformed what was once a relationship of quiet resentment into genuine partnership and mutual respect. She often walked the estate's farmlands herself, speaking directly with families she had come to know well over the years, understanding intimately the value of listening to concerns that other duchesses might never have thought to ask about at all. Of Constance, little had been heard in recent years beyond occasional, distant reports. She had eventually married a widowed gentleman of modest means from a neighboring county, a match considerably less grand than the future she had once schemed so desperately to secure for herself at Ashworth Hall. Whether she had found any genuine contentment in that quieter life, Eliza and Nathaniel could not say, though neither of them spent much time wondering about it anymore, the wounds of those difficult early months having long since healed into simple, distant memory, rather than lingering resentment. Edmund surprisingly had written to Nathaniel some 2 years after his departure, a letter of genuine humility acknowledging the wrongs he had committed and expressing gratitude, unexpected even to himself, for the mercy Nathaniel had shown in not pursuing formal prosecution against him. He had built a modest but respectable life for himself, managing accounts in his adopted town, eventually marrying a merchant's daughter and settling into a existence far removed from the privileged idleness he had once assumed would always be his birthright. Nathaniel had responded to the letter graciously, and though the two cousins remained distant, an uneasy peace had settled between them that neither felt any need to disturb. On a warm afternoon in early summer, Eliza received an unexpected letter from a young woman she had never met, a distant relation on her mother's side who had somehow learned, through the winding channels of family gossip, of Eliza's remarkable story, and had written seeking advice, having recently found herself in similarly reduced circumstances following her own father's business failure. Eliza read the letter twice, memories of her own desperate early days at Ashworth Hall rising vividly to mind, the fear and humiliation she had once endured before circumstances and, admittedly, considerable good fortune had transformed her life so completely. She spent the following days composing a careful, thoughtful reply, offering not empty reassurance but practical guidance and, more importantly, an offer of genuine assistance, a position within the Ashworth household should the young woman wish to take it, or financial support to pursue whatever alternative path she preferred instead. "You cannot save every family that falls on hard fortune," Nathaniel observed gently, watching her seal the letter that evening. "No," Eliza agreed, "but I can save this one family at least, from the worst of what I once endured alone. That feels like a reasonable use of the good fortune life has given me since." It was this quality in her, Nathaniel often reflected, that had transformed not only his own life but the entire character of Ashworth Hall itself, a genuine, unwavering commitment to fairness and compassion that no amount of privilege had ever managed to erode. The servant girl who had once knelt on cold marble floors, humiliated and voiceless, had become a duchess whose quiet strength and generosity were spoken of, with genuine warmth and admiration, throughout the entire county. That evening, as the family gathered for a simple dinner in the smaller, more intimate dining room they preferred to the grand formal hall reserved for larger occasions, young Charlotte climbed into her father's lap between courses, demanding a story before bedtime approached. "Tell me again," she insisted, "about how you found Mother." Nathaniel exchanged a warm, knowing glance with Eliza across the table, the familiar request bringing, as it always did, a smile to both their faces. "Well," he began, settling his daughter more comfortably against him. "It began with a broken vase, and a young woman who knelt to clean up the mess with more grace and dignity than anyone in that entire room, including myself, quite deserved to witness." Charlotte listened, wide-eyed and delighted, to a story she had heard many times before but never tired of hearing again, a story of injustice overcome, of cruelty defeated, and of two people who had found, against every expectation society once held for them, a love strong enough to reshape an entire household's future. After dinner, once Charlotte had finally been coaxed to bed despite her protests that the story deserved a second telling, Eliza and Nathaniel walked together through the quiet corridors of the house, pausing as they often did near the small portrait gallery where generations of Ashworth family history hung alongside the newer additions Eliza had insisted upon including. "Do you ever think of how differently things might have turned out?" Eliza asked, studying her father's restored portrait in the soft evening light. "If you had returned to Ashworth Hall a week later than you did, after Constance had already dismissed me over that broken vase?" Nathaniel considered the question seriously, as he always did when Eliza raised such thoughts, understanding that the fragility of their happiness, however secure it now felt, remained something she occasionally needed to examine aloud, a habit born of years spent expecting misfortune around every corner. "I think," he said finally, "that some things find their way to happening regardless of timing. Perhaps I would have arrived to find you already gone, and spent months searching for you once I learned the truth of what my family owed yours. Perhaps the path would have looked different, harder even, but I do not think I could have discovered the truth of your father's letters, and simply let the matter rest, whether or not you remained in this house to witness it." "That is a comforting thought," Eliza said, leaning into him. "It is also, I suspect, entirely true," Nathaniel replied. "Some partnerships are built not merely on fortunate timing, but on two people who recognize in each other something worth pursuing no matter the obstacles standing between them." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, passing through rooms that held years of shared history now, each corner of Ashworth Hall carrying some memory of the long journey that had brought them to this settled, contented life together. The nursery, where Charlotte had taken her first uncertain steps, the study, where Nathaniel had first discovered the bundle of old letters that changed everything, the grand staircase, where he had once descended with such fury to defend her dignity before an audience of watching guests. Mrs. Whitfield joined them briefly near the kitchen, having come up from her cottage for her regular evening visit, and the three of them shared a quiet cup of tea together as they often did, old habits of affection and loyalty having long since worn smooth into comfortable routine. "The estate has never looked finer," the old housekeeper observed, watching the two of them with the same fond pride she had carried since the earliest days of their courtship. "And I do not mean merely the gardens or the furnishings, Your Grace, though those have certainly improved as well. I mean the spirit of the place. This house feels alive now, in a way it never did during the years I served under less generous management." "We owe much of that to you," Eliza said warmly. "Your protection during those difficult early years made everything that followed possible." Mrs. Whitfield waved off the compliment with characteristic modesty, though her eyes shone with unmistakable emotion. "I merely recognized worth when I saw it, my dear. The rest, you and the Duke accomplished entirely on your own." As the evening deepened and Mrs. Whitfield finally returned to her cottage, Eliza and Nathaniel made their way to the same gardens where they had once sat together on their wedding anniversary years before, the roses now grown thick and fragrant with the passing seasons, a living testament to time's steady healing of even the deepest wounds. Outside the tall windows of Ashworth Hall, the gardens Eliza had once run through as a carefree child, lost to her for so many painful years before being reclaimed at last, glowed softly in the fading evening light, roses blooming exactly as they had bloomed for generations, patient witnesses to a story that had finally, after so much hardship, found its proper and lasting happiness.